I'm really excited about presenting an overview of our project, the project with Corinna Mieth, Gareth, and Eva, especially since some of the people are most relevant for my project, namely Pauline Kleingeld and both of the Sam Case here, are in the room. So I'd be really interested to hear what you have to say. Corinna Mieth was supposed to present together with me because some of the work we've done collaboratively. She's not here, so I'm going to present this on my own. And the project is funded partly by the UK government and partly by the German government. And so the idea is basically that we're looking at the formula of humanity and the formula of the kingdom of ends, propose new readings of these formulas, and then apply these readings to migration, climate ethics, and decent work, or good work. So basically the project is about mistreatment, but also treating well, and so far we mainly gotten around to mistreatment, academically and otherwise. I want to focus on the formula of humanity. I think Gareth might be after me, he might say a bit more about the kingdom of ends. So when it comes to the formula of humanity, the main idea is that we think that the formula of humanity needs more categories of wrongdoing. By categories of wrongdoing, I mean this is never merely as a means, right? So this is, we think, treating someone as a mere means is one paradigmatic example of mistreating someone, and we think there should be others. Before I present my argument for that and propose new categories of mistreatment, I just want to make a few assumptions apparent, partly because I know that some of you might disagree with these assumptions, so I want to make it basically apparent where I would depart from some of you so we can have a debate about that afterwards. So the first point is that Pauline Kleingeld obviously has this very interesting and great paper where she argues that the formula of humanity technically, if you look at the German, it should not say treat humanity, but rather use humanity. And exegetically, I think that's correct. But I think that the formula of humanity would be too narrow if we understand it as only being concerned with using, because you can mistreat people without using them. And that's why philosophically we should think that Kant means treating. I'm happy to say more about that in the Q&A. Basically, the idea is that the formula of humanity is one of the formulations of the supreme principle of morality, and as such it should cover all of morality, not just cases of using agents. Even treating, I think, might be too narrow, but I'm going with treating for the time being. Then the second assumption is, I find that relatively uncontroversial, but maybe some of you disagree, that so the first part of the formula of humanity always at the same time as an end generates imperfect duties. The second part, never merely as a means, generates perfect duties. And there's a slight complication here that I think Melissa was the first to point out, that on this picture it would be the case that perfect duties are also imperfect duties, right? By that I mean that if you treat someone as a mere means, you're violating a perfect duty, but you're also not treating that person as an end in themselves, and thereby also violating an imperfect duty. But the morally salient issue here is that you're violating a perfect duty. However, so do bear in mind that so I think that treat others as ends is the most encompassing term, right? And then treating someone as a mere means is basically a subcategory of failing to treat someone as an end. I mean, that's also true for the other categories I'll be introducing, such as treating people as a mere thing, or treating people as a mere enemy or mere threat. These are all failures of not treating someone as an end. And then I should say that I don't buy consent readings of the formula of humanity. Samuel Kahn has a very nice paper recently in the Journal of Value Inquiry where he does a really good job at criticizing consent readings. Melissa also has done work on that. So the reason why I'm skeptical of the consent reading is because it gives you this overarching narrative where basically if you're the consent reading, you might say that this is all about whether or not people can consent to what you're doing or do actually consent to what you're doing. And I think it's actually quite far away from how Kant at least describes something as treating someone as a mere means. And I do think that you can treat someone as a mere means with their consent. So there are some cases where Kant, for instance, says that, or at least one where he says you ought not to make yourself a mere means for others. I read that as Kant saying there can be cases where you yourself make yourself an instrument for someone else, and that's immoral, but it is consensual insofar as you yourself bring yourself in that position, you're consenting to that treatment, but you ought not to. So I do think that we can consent to violations of perfect duties, but we ought not to. I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. And so then I also assume that the second part of the formula of humanity as it stands, don't treat it as a mere means, captures a specific form of wrongdoing, a very significant one. I think in the past, I said it captures exploitation, but then Melissa has a nice working paper on exploitation where she argues that actually treating someone as a mere means is not equivalent to exploitation. Instead, I think it probably captures something like instrumentalization or maybe objectification of some kind, which is one specific way of severely mistreating an agent, right? So you're treating them as if they are nothing but a tool to your ends. That's what I take never merely as a means. And if you accept that, so if you think that treating someone as a mere means isn't a highly technical concept, but supposed to capture a specific form of wrongdoing, you might think there are other severe forms of mistreatment that should also be clearly prohibited. And so that's why I think there should be additional categories in the formula of humanity. So the general idea, that's how Corinna and I first started to think about that project, is that instrumentalization as the one paradigm or example of violation of a perfect duty in the formula of humanity is both too narrow and too broad. Too narrow, there are a few forms of mistreatment that can be severe, especially worrisome, that should be strictly prohibited, that don't count as instrumentalization. One is if you're being indifferent towards someone. You're not using that person as a tool because the tool is useful for you, right? But if you're being indifferent towards someone, this person is neither useful nor is that person threatening to you. It's just an object of indifference. But if you let the child drown in a shallow pond, you might think that you have severely mistreated that child, even though you haven't instrumentalized it. Then other examples are hostility and degradation. So sometimes you don't even think that someone is irrelevant to you, or you're not indifferent towards that person. You actually positively want that person gone, right? You want the person out of your society or out of the world because that person is of disvalue to you, instrumentally or otherwise. And that is captured by the attitude of hostility. And then degradation is a bit more complicated. I'll say a bit more about that later on. So basically the idea being, if you think that treating as a mere means is a form of instrumentalization, instrumentalization assumes that someone is of instrumental value to you and you're exploiting that value, or you're drawing on that value in inappropriate ways, but not everyone you're mistreating is instrumentally valuable to you. And then there's also a sense in which the formula of humanity as it stands might be too broad. And that's because there's a worry that if we warn people against treatment as mere means, we might be overlooking the positive role that being a means can play. And that's something where especially Gareth, and to some extent Eva also, work on. Namely this idea that Laura mentioned in her talk already, that in the kingdom of ends, we are ends and means for each other, right? So there's a positive ethical role to being a means. You're being useful for someone, and by being useful, you're also being part of society in a way that people who aren't means are not. One really nice illustrative example of that is that in the UK, asylum seekers don't have the right to work for a living. Instead, they get money by the state. Now you might think, this is great, right? Who wants to work? It's much better, not to work and just, get money from the government. Now, first of all, they get very little, but you could also think of a situation where they actually got an adequate amount of money. But what's interesting is that when you interview asylum seekers, one of the things that comes up again and again is that they really hate being mere recipients, just getting money, not being allowed to be fully part of society in a way that people who work for a living are, right? Because if you work for a living, you meet new people, you have new opportunities, you make a positive impact on society, you have a greater degree of agency, you have a more secure status in society. There are loads of benefits that come with being a means for others on your own terms, and being denied this status can be a form of wronging an agent, right? So there are very positive aspects of being a means for others. And one worry is that if we think that the main or only way of mistreating someone is treating them as a mere means, we might think that maybe we should reduce the amount of occasions for people to be means for others, right? Because if you're not means for someone else, you can't be a mere means for that person. So that seems to be ethically safe. But actually it's not because it's actually a good thing to be allowed to be a means for others. And there are also outright cynical forms of drawing on this exploitation paradigm of instrumentalization as a chief wrongdoing, or chief form of wrongdoing. A colleague of mine in Bristol, sociologist Julia O'Connell-Davidson, works on migration enforcement in the UK, and there is this weird discourse in the UK, probably also other countries, where any form of coming to the UK irregularly is seen as an instance of human trafficking, and that is usually linked to modern slavery. And then basically the idea is that politicians will claim that we must crack down on illegal immigration because it's basically slavery. And that's a form of exploitation, instrumentalization is really, really bad, when in fact most people who come irregularly to the UK just basically want to work in the UK, but they don't have the right to do that. Instead, they're basically being pursued by the police because they are in some way implicated in modern slavery in a vague sense, right? So this idea that people must be protected against being a means at all costs can come at the cost of allowing them to fully participate in society. And then I think I don't need to talk more about that because Laura already did this. It was actually really surprising for me to discover that when Kant describes the kingdom of ends, he says that in the kingdom of ends we must be ends and means for each other. Because you would expect, if you only know the formula of humanity, that he would say in the kingdom of ends we are ends and never mere means for each other, right? But he doesn't. He says actually being a means for others is an essential part of the kingdom of ends. So we need to rethink the role of means and the role of mere means in Kantian ethics. Okay, so, and then ultimately we propose that maybe the formula of humanity should be something like treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means, never merely as a thing, never merely as an enemy, and then maybe also never as a negative end. The category of negative end works a bit differently from the other categories, and I'll say more about that towards the end of my talk. Let me now explain what these new categories mean. First, but before I do that, should I speak louder, slower, funnier? Okay. Okay. So, new categories. As I already said, never treat as mere means basically says don't instrumentalize people. And that's a very important ethical command, but it's not the only thing that should be strictly prohibited. I also think that certain forms of indifference should be strictly prohibited. Not all forms of indifference, but extreme forms, where you let someone drown in the shallow pond even though you could easily save that person. And I suggest that we call that don't treat someone as a mere thing. Thing here is a bit of somewhat gimmicky. I'm not sure what the best term here is. You could also just say, maybe the formula of humanity should be something like, don't treat as a mere means, don't be indifferent, don't be hostile. But I thought it might be better, or it might fit better into the formula of humanity to find a catchy mere something term for that. And my idea is it's mere thing. By thing, I mean something that is even stripped of its instrumental value, right? So mere means have instrumental value, whereas mere things, if you treat someone as a mere thing, you're not treating them as a person, right? And you're also not treating them as a means, right? So the person doesn't have inherent value for you, doesn't have instrumental value. You're basically indifferent towards that object. Then there's also the category of mere enemy, and we're still not quite sure what the best term here is. I prefer enemy, Corinna prefers threat. The idea being that sometimes something is neither useful nor an object of indifference, but positively threatening, either because it's instrumentally threatening or because there's something supposedly inherently deficient about that person. So instrumentally threatening, an example would be that you inherit money, but you would inherit money, but you're second in line, right? There's someone else who inherits money first. You really want that money, so it's really bad for you that this other person exists, right? And you might then go and kill that person to inherit the money, but in that case, this person isn't a means for you, right? Because you'd be much better off if the person had never existed, because then you would inherit the money immediately, right? So you're here wronging, mistreating a person because you want them gone, not because you want to draw on their instrumental use for you. And then you can also think of cases where someone is not just instrumentally detrimental to you, but where you might think that this person or this person's group is somehow scheming against your group, is a perpetual enemy, is trying to corrupt your culture or something like that. The certain forms of racist treatment, for instance, would fit that bill, where you don't think that this other group is useful for me, but rather a danger or detrimental to my values. Okay, a few notes. As I said, these are the mere thing, mere enemy, are to some extent technical terms. It's not clear that they are the best possible terms, but I do think they make clear that what we have here is either instrumental use, neither instrumental use nor disvalue, and some form of disvalue that we are ascribing to a person, that we're reducing a person to. So the driving force behind this proposed extension is systematic. We want to account for the phenomena. Phenomena here being a very bad word, because we don't mean the Kantian phenomena as in this table here is obviously a phenomenon. No, we mean something like the complexities of many ethical issues. I think a really good example for that is, and for treatment as a mere thing, is that in the UK, there was a case a few months ago where a lot of migrant children, unaccompanied migrant children that were put in asylum hospitals, asylum hotels, went missing. So the idea is when children arrive in the UK without parents, no one really knows what to do with them. So you can't send them back, no one really wants them, so they are just being put in some hotel that the government rents. And then they're basically being left to their own devices. And then an investigative journalist looked into what's going on with these children, how are they doing, and found out that a lot of them have disappeared. Around 100 children gone, right? We don't quite know where they are. Some of them might have gone back to their home country or might have gone to another country. Probably a lot of them have been abducted by criminal gangs. And there wasn't much interest in that. So I think it's an interesting ethical case, ethical problem, and it's not, I think the main issue here is not instrumentalizing these children. I think these children they were instrumentalized by criminal gangs who abducted them, but the UK government and the UK public, they do not have an instrumental attitude towards these children. They have an attitude of indifference or maybe hostility, right? They really don't care, and that's the problem here. That they take these children, put them somewhere, forget about them. And normally, if 100 English children were to all of a sudden disappear, that would be a huge story, right? There'd be endless amounts of police resources being put into finding these children. So there's clearly something going very, very wrong here, but it's not instrumentalization, at least not on the part of the UK public, but an extreme case of indifference or maybe hostility. So these are the kinds of things that we want to capture, right? That we have these important ethical issues where we want to account for the perspective of the perpetrators. Do they have an instrumental attitude, another attitude? Also the perspective of the victims. Because one interesting aspect of being a mere means for someone is that a good tool is a great thing, right? If you have a really nice tool, usually you want to preserve that tool. You might go to great lengths even to not have that tool go to waste, right? You might put quite a bit of effort into maintaining your tool. I think Germans are like that with cars. Germans love their cars, right? Every Sunday they wash their cars for 3 hours or so, right? The cars are clearly a tool, but they're putting a lot of energy into their cars. There is a sense in which, if you are, even if you're a mere tool for someone, a mere means, another person might show certain forms of regard for you, at least because it's instrumentally prudent for that person. But that's not the case if you're a mere thing for that person, right? Because the person doesn't care at all. And if you're a mere enemy, it's even worse, right? The person might spend a lot of energy into destroying you, which you wouldn't do with a good tool, right? Whether or not you're being treated as a mere means, mere thing, mere tool, a mere enemy, might make quite a difference in terms of what it is rational for the perpetrator to do to you, and also how you experience that wrongdoing. And we want to account for that, and that's why we think we need more categories. And then I should also say that we do think that all of the new categories we are introducing, there is textual evidence that Kant acknowledges these forms of wrongdoing. So we're not saying that Kant had no idea that wrongdoing and hostility is bad. I mean, there are clear passages where Kant talks about these wrongs. It's just that they're not reflected in the way that he formulates his formula of humanity, right? So we're basically just drawing out certain aspects that we already find in Kant, making them more explicit in order to reach a formula of humanity version of the formula that is better able to accommodate the phenomena, capture the phenomena. Then I think I already walked you through the ways in which we think that the categories are distinct. Impact and perspective of victim, motivation, perspective of perpetrator, side constraints, meaning prudential side constraints. You wouldn't destroy a nice tool, but you would probably try to destroy someone who you think is nothing but a mortal enemy. And then there may also be different forms of addressing these mistreatments. For instance, if one way of helping newly arrived asylum seekers to gain, to stop being treated as a mere thing could be to give them the right to work, because once you become a means for others on your own terms, people have an investment in you, right? They might value the contribution you're making to society and your labor, and thus you might stop being a mere thing for someone. Whereas if you're being treated as a mere means, then obviously the issue would rather be that we need better workplace regulations or other forms of that might curtail ways that agents are being instrumentalized in their job or in other functions. Okay. And then also the forms of mistreatment, the different categories. Whilst I think they're distinct, it's not the case that they always occur in complete independence of each other. Quite often they occur together. Indifference, treating as a mere thing, is particularly interesting. Often when someone is being instrumentalized or being treated as a mere enemy, there are other people that are just indifferent towards that person, right? So I think Michelle Alexander in her The New Jim Crow has this really interesting remark about slavery, where she says in the American South during slavery, most white people didn't own slaves themselves, right? It was only a rich elite that owned slaves, but most white people were indifferent towards the plight of slaves, and that allowed slavery to exist, right? So basically indifference creates or treating as a mere thing creates a social setting where people can inflict other wrongs, such as treatment as mere means or mere enemy on people. And one particular interesting and illustrative example for how categories interact is migration blackmail. So there were these cases where I think Erdogan in Turkey and Lukashenko in Belarus try to blackmail the European Union. So they basically said, we have millions of of refugees here in Turkey or in Belarus. And if you, European Union, if you do not make certain concessions, we open our borders and all these refugees come to your countries. That's interesting because, Erdogan and Lukashenko, they clearly treat refugees as mere means, right? They are tools for them to gain leverage. But their blackmail would be completely ineffective if Europeans also had an instrumental attitude, a merely instrumental attitude towards refugees, because they would then say, well, you know, you're basically telling us that you're going to send us a lot of tools that we can use as we please. That's actually good for us, right? No, I think a lot of Europeans had a hostile attitude towards migrants or towards refugees. They didn't want them, right? And that's why the blackmail could work in the first place, right? Because they threatened Europeans with something that they wanted to avoid, not something they wanted to use. Okay, now, why these categories? And that's basically what I call, somewhat jokingly, my transcendental deduction of these categories. It's not really, but so I do think that the three categories here are to some extent are not arbitrary, because, and you can tell a neat story about why it's these three categories, the two news that we're introducing and mere means. So it seems to me that whenever you come across someone and you're not treating them as an end in themselves, as a person of inherent value, of unconditional value, then I think there are only three options. You can either treat this person as being instrumentally useful to you, as neither useful nor positively harmful, or as harmful, right? So you're either positive because of the instrumental value, you're negative because of instrumental disvalue, or you're neither, right? So instrumental value, mere means, neither value nor disvalue, mere thing, some form of disvalue, mere enemy. And this seems potentially exhaustive. Now, I also actually think there are other categories. So that's why I don't really think that's a transcendental deduction. It's just a nice story that I can tell about why it must be these three categories that are particularly interesting. But in the wake of our research, we've come across other categories, and we've entertained other categories. One particularly interesting one is near hero. André Grale, who is at the University of Cologne, has proposed this to capture the way that healthcare workers were mistreated in the pandemic. The idea, I don't know if you had that in other countries, but in the UK, we would, during COVID, we would go, like once a week, we would go outside and clap for nurses. And I think the idea was that these nurses are total heroes, and they were ostensibly worshipped, but their working conditions were terrible. So Andre thinks there is some type of problematic ideology here going on where these people are reduced to their status as basically being moral saints, who are worshipped for it, but who basically have no personal needs, right? Because a hero is just in it for the good, right? That's why these people do what they do. And if you think that, then you might think we don't need to address their material concerns. It would almost be inappropriate, right? They're heroes, so we don't need to give them a salary raise. So that's one of the ways that he tries to argue there's a distinct form of wrongdoing. And a few other examples. I think there's mere obstacle. I think Samuel Kirsten in his book, I think you have the category of obstacle. I don't know if you talk about mere obstacle. So there might be someone who's just in your way. You don't hate that person, but there's also nothing you wouldn't do to them to get that person out of your way. I think that's probably a case of treating as a mere enemy, but I'm not entirely sure whether the categories coincide. You could also think there's something like a mere recipient, an asylum seeker who is getting money from the government but doesn't have the right to work. So they're basically degraded to the status of someone who just receives from the government and has no opportunity of giving back in any way and on their own terms. This might be a form of wrongdoing. And then probably the wackiest category that we have entertained is mere wife. And the idea here was that if you have a housewife in the 1950s, right, the husband is not really instrumentalizing the wife in any straightforward sense. They might make sacrifices that they wouldn't make for a mere tool for their car, but if that person is basically forced to conform to the gender norms at the time, for instance, not allowed to take up work, then we might think that she's being reduced to something that's morally problematic, even though it wouldn't really be captured by instrumentalization or by being treated as a mere thing or a mere enemy. So I don't want to say this really is a category we should accept, but it's one of the categories that we thought about. It might be interesting, and one can talk about whether this category should be part of the formula of humanity. Basically, the idea is that mere means that an agent is reduced to something other than a person, or something other than an entity of unconditional value. And this can be reduced to a tool. Then we have treatment as a mere means, but tools are not the only alternative to personhood, right? You could reduce them to an enemy, a thing, a recipient, and so on. And that's basically what we're interested in. How many of these categories exist, or how many of these categories are plausible to allow into the formula of humanity. And now let me address a special case, and I think that's a really interesting one. And it's mainly Corinna who worked on that, and Corinna and Gareth, actually. So Corinna thinks that some forms of mistreatment actually only make sense for people who are persons. This might even be the case for some forms of treatment as mere means, right? Sometimes you actually need a tool that has agency. Sometimes maybe not, right? Sometimes you just, I don't know, I need to reach something on the top shelf, and there's Gareth sitting in front of the shelf, and I just climb on him as if he was a chair, right? It doesn't matter that he has agency, but in many cases, actually, we do need others to be agents. Otherwise, they couldn't be good tools for us. Now, Corinna is interested in more extreme cases where a form of where we mistreat someone because specifically they are ends in themselves. She thinks that certain forms of degrading treatment only make sense, or certain forms of treating someone as if they are not human only make sense if the other person is a human. Her example is Donald Trump putting migrant children into cages. The idea here is that cages are for mere animals, right? If you put a human being into a cage, you're making symbolically a point that I do not regard this person as a human being, but that only makes sense if that other person is a human being and you sort of acknowledge that. Now, Corinna then argues that this shows that we can mistreat someone as an end in themselves, right? Some forms of mistreatment specifically target your status as ends in themselves. And if that's correct, then actually the first part of the formula of humanity that I initially thought is uncontroversial, because obviously you should treat people as ends in themselves, is actually sort of an insufficient ethical command, because you can treat people as ends in themselves and by doing so mistreat them, right? That's the idea of a negative end. You're basically mistreating someone as an end in themselves. In which case the formula of humanity would have to say something like, treat others as ends in themselves, but not in a degrading way. Or don't mistreat people as ends in themselves, or something like that. So that could be an additional qualification to the formula of humanity. Now I think that's my penultimate slide. I want to address one objection that a number of people have made. I'm sure a number of you already have that objection in mind. I think Lucy Alice might be the first to make that objection. So you might say that, well, Martin, look, what's going on here is that never treat as a mere means. Clearly, mere means is a technical term here, right? And you treat it in a very literal way as instrumentalizing someone. That's not what Kant means. Rather, he means something like, don't severely mistreat someone. That's what he means by treating as a mere means, or maybe don't treat them in ways that they can't consent to, something like that. Now, I think that is probably not the best way of reading Kant, because if you really mean that treating as a mere means is just a form of severe mistreatment, then the formula of humanity would be a bit empty, because it would basically say treat people as ends in themselves and don't mistreat them severely. But then you want to know what that means, right? And an advantage of reading mere means in a literal sense is it gives you a story of what that means, namely don't instrumentalize agents. I think that's better, it's just not complete. If you really like that objection, then I could always, as a fallback, basically say, okay, I concede that mere means is a technical term, but my project is still valuable because I'm spelling out with my new categories, I'm spelling out what it means to treat someone as a mere means, right? And then the formula of humanity should be treat as end, never merely as a means in a technical sense, and that means don't treat them as a mere means in a literal sense, don't instrumentalize them, don't treat them as a mere thing, mere enemy, right? So I could always still maintain that even if you convinced me that mere means is used in a technical sense. Then one final problem that I'm struggling with, just to highlight that, is the issue of stringency. So it seems that clearly never instrumentalize anyone, never treat them as a mere enemy. That's quite bad if you want to positively exterminate someone. Never do that. I'm not so sure that you should never treat someone as a mere thing, because treating someone as a mere thing means that you have to avoid indifference towards that person, and that requires positive action, right? Don't treat as a mere means or mere enemy just requires inaction, whereas never treat as a mere thing might be a positive duty. It might require that you administer life-saving aid. So this duty seems to work somewhat differently than the other prohibitions. And as such, it raises questions such as who is the duty holder, the duty bearer? Can it maybe sometimes be permissible to be indifferent? For instance, if someone catcalls you, that person specifically wants you to react, but it seems to be perfectly within your rights to just ignore that person, right? So that's why I think the prohibition against treatment as a mere thing has somewhat of a hybrid status. I think it's a very stringent duty, more stringent than, for instance, beneficence, which means help others with their ends, be they vital ends or not, but it might be less stringent than never treat as a mere means or mere enemy. I actually think that we should embrace these duties because the moral world is complex, and it would be surprising if there are only two types of duties, namely perfect ones and imperfect ones. There are probably very many kinds of duties. Thanks for your attention.